What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the final installment of my 2023 contest prep vlog. What we're going to have playing in the background is my pro debut at WNBF Worlds in the middleweight division on Sunday. That was after the amateur show on Saturday, where I coached. We did some filming, and we also did an awesome photo shoot the day afterwards. We had a great team event, and you're going to see a lot of that media, a lot of that content coming out or being used in the coming months. For those of you who don't know, WNBF Worlds is the biggest and arguably most competitive natural bodybuilding show in the world. There's over 50 international affiliates now, and there was over 250 athletes. And that may not sound entirely huge compared to some events, but remember, you have to qualify for this. So to compete as an amateur on Saturday, you've got to place first in a class of 5 or more, top 3 in a class of 5 or more, or first in a class of 3 or 4, and you can't even qualify if the class is smaller than that. And then, of course, there are different rules depending on the country. Sometimes you have to place even higher than that. So the best amateurs in the world were competing on Saturday in a super pro qualifier format. So if your class is big enough, just winning your class could get you a pro card. If not, then you'd have to win the overall or beat one of the other folks who got a pro card in that overall to turn pro. And really briefly, I'm just going to talk about this pro class. I got an email from the WNBF secretary just yesterday. I found out I placed 7th, which is exactly where I had myself, and something I'm very proud of, because that means I placed ahead of 2 other pros. I definitely belonged, and when I looked at the points, I was a little bit closer to 6th rather than 8th. So I can't tell you how happy I am with that, and that means I can set some goals moving into the future now that I know where I am and try to move up the ranks as a pro over the years. And everyone in this class is a very, very worthy competitor. They were either the top amateur in their country in the year they competed, because they turned pro and were able to compete, or they're already a competitive pro, because you have to qualify for Worlds by doing a pro show in advance of Worlds. And that's exactly what we see here. So the top 5, which is the only thing, the only people who got to learn their placing on the day, consisted of the 5 gentlemen who are in the center of the screen right now. The guy dead center, that's Benjamin Schuster, who's a 21-year-old phenom coming out of Germany. He won his WNBF pro card. He won a WNBF pro show, beating Dirk Emmerich in the overall. He won the EVO and ANBF Open Invitational natural shows and beat everybody basically in Europe who showed up. And he also won a PNBA pro card and a PNBA pro show this year before coming to Worlds to win the middleweights. And he clashed with the person on his left. That's Fredrik Ibsen, one of the best bodybuilders in Europe as well, from Denmark. They battled that out a number of times, and he just barely edged out Fredrik. I would say he's a little bit leaner than Fredrik. Fredrik was a little bit bigger. Could have gone either way, but I think there was probably a better argument for Benjamin Schuster. So 2 top-level bodybuilders, number 1 and 2. Number 3 is on their right. That is Agostino Russo. He is an American by way of Italy, and I actually had the pleasure of meeting him and watching him win the pro portion of the Washington State, which Jeff and I did. Jeff placed 2nd. Agostino beat him in his pro debut. So a pro champion in his own right. He beat Jeff earlier in the year. Jeff wasn't at 100%, but nonetheless, as you can see, amazing physique. And then in 4th is the person right to Agostino's left, and that is Douglas King from the Cayman Islands. He actually won the middleweights on Saturday, got his pro card, and then said, you know what, I want even more than that, and he won the overalls. He can arguably say he's the best amateur bodybuilder, best amateur natural bodybuilder in the world, and unsurprisingly, he went on to then place 4th in this pro class. And then in 5th is another well-deserving champion, just to the left of Benjamin Schuster right now, and just to my left, to my left, but your right of me. So between me and Benjamin, that's Malcolm Cooper. He won the WNBF Universe this year, as well as the IPE Universe. So he is Mr. Universe, and that's your top 5. Incredibly impressive. I'm not sure who placed 6th, 8th, and 9th. But on the very far right of the screen, you got Finbar Murphy from Ireland, really thick pro, based upon how we were moved. I think he was in 6th. And then just next to me, that is a gentleman from Italy, who I believe, if I had to guess, placed 8th. And then not currently on screen, but you'll see him at some point, as a gentleman from Israel, who I believe was in the 9th spot. So that's how this shook out. But I've had a lot of requests asking me to talk about how my prep went overall. What were my numbers? What kind of cardio did I do? And what type of training did I do? First, I would refer you all to the very first episode where I went over my training, and also the episode where I recapped my powerlifting meet. But just as a reminder, I took an approach where I started with a single on the squat, bench, or deadlift on most days of the week, and then just a little bit of back off work before I did my bodybuilding work, training 5 days per week. And I did that because I wanted to compete as an 83 kilo lifter in powerlifting as a master's for the first time and see how that would shake out. I recapped that whole experience, in one of my earlier episodes, but needless to say, it went really well, and I was able to improve my squat and deadlift throughout prep, compete as an 83, and put up, it's a PB total because I've never competed as an 83, but I placed fourth in a sub-national level event that is our North Island Championships, and I was really pleased with my performance because I got it wasn't a PB, but I improved my squat and my deadlift while dropping all the way from 96 kilos where I started this prep down to 83 for that comp, which I believe was in July. So I was down to around 83 kilos in July, and right around that point, we started to take a more structured approach to my nutrition. Up to that point, I was largely going more intuitively. So I knew how many calories I was eating, of course. I knew roughly where my macros were, and I would have some high days, and I had like one diet break. But for the most part, I was not doing high days, not doing diet breaks because I didn't feel like I needed it. I wasn't lean enough yet, but I did start to get lean enough to where we did some right around June, July. That's when I started dipping into the low 80s, started really looking the part. You might recall I went down to Grant Tinsley's lab and got body fat tested, and I was single digit just at that point, and things really started to get leaner from there. So after the powerlifting meet, I dropped back on the amount of powerlifting training. I just did a minimum amount just to maintain my strength, and my training became more bodybuilding focused. I actually moved from training 5 days per week to 6 days per week because I felt like I could. My recovery was on point, and I was doing a lot more isolation movements, machine movements, lighter movements. And I had more time because it's just much more efficient when you're not having to do squat, bench, and deadlift as frequently. And I was literally just hitting these movements once every 1 to 2 weeks with a single and occasionally back off work and occasionally working it into my hypertrophy training. But I was essentially following a format where I would train freestyle. Not that I didn't have a plan, but freestyle in terms of I had no limit on which body part I'd train on any given day. I had a volume allocation that I was trying to hit for all my different muscle groups, and I would spread that out evenly throughout the week and then occasionally hit a single on the big three. And that was basically my approach all the way through prep. And I actually ended up dropping out the singles on the big three once I started competing because of the demands of travel. So September 30th was my first show. I recapped all my shows in the last episode, so I won't do that again. But I had to travel down to Christchurch from Auckland, which is, just the southern part of New Zealand. And then the very next weekend, I competed in the Battle of the Bay. And then the weekend after that, the Washington State. So I spent a couple weeks at Jeff's house in the States. And then I came home back to New Zealand. And then 2 weeks later, I had to go to Australia to compete in Brisbane, where I got my pro card and qualified for Pro Worlds. And then 3 weeks later, I was back in Seattle and Washington at Worlds, which you're looking at now. So there was 5 shows in 7 weeks. And only one of those shows was actually my home country, and one was close in Australia. So the ability to keep doing the power lifts and the rationale to do so kind of fell to the wayside. I didn't want to travel with a belt, squat shoes, deadlift shoes, wrist wraps, and all the stuff on knee sleeves, and it was just too much. So I primarily focused on hypertrophy training for the last 7 weeks, and occasionally would get in a squat, bench, or deadlift, but it probably was maybe 3 deadlift sessions, 3 squat sessions, and 3 bench sessions over that 7-week period. I really just focused on doing everything I could to come in well. Nutrition-wise, we ended up having a more structured approach where I started doing a 5 and 2. So 5 low days, 2 high days. And these low days started around, say, 1,700 to 2,000 calories. And eventually they got as low as 1,400 to 1,700 calories, auto-regulated based upon hunger, energy levels, performance, how full I looked, my sleep quality. And essentially, Alberto and I said something like, hey, make sure you keep a banana behind a glass case so that you can break in case of emergency. Even when you're digging, you should know how bad should be. And there is a limit, and that's something that young bodybuilders don't get. They think they just have to grind themselves into dust. but it is really about preserving your physiology and your psychology when you need to diet, as long as this diet was, which was 41 weeks, and I got absolutely peeled. And after the October show, where I was about as lean as I was in 2019, I got even leaner. So this is the leanest I've ever been, what you're looking at on stage, the biggest I've ever been and the most balanced. And thank God it happened on the pro stage, right? So, but to achieve that, I had to preserve as much as possible. And this prep was the easiest prep I've ever had. That's not to say it was easy, but just compared to prior preps. There were definitely some hard times, but it never got too hard. We never pushed the envelope too much. And some of the approaches that, did take some real digging was after my 3 shows in a row, where essentially I just moved my refeeds around and we did them on either Thursday, Friday, or Wednesday, Thursday, and then tapered down into the show so I could clean up and look my best on game day. After the Washington, where I had 2 more weeks, we just dug all the way straight through. So we had basically 10 low days before then I ran my peak week for that Australia show. For Worlds, the plan was with 3 weeks after Australia, we basically split it in half. We did about a week and a half of digging, and we pushed real hard. We got as high as 12K steps and 15 to 1,600 calories on a day-to-day basis. That wasn't quite as rough as when I ran between the Battle of the Bay and the Washington. We got up to 15K steps, and I kept it between like 1,400 to 1,500 calories. And that was to just get real tight. But those are the 2 digging phases we had, and they weren't that bad. I mean, that may sound really brutal, but when there's a light at the end of the tunnel and it's a short period, it's really not that bad, to be 100% honest with you. And I've certainly done worse, believe it or not. So yeah, essentially the approach was that I started with a very low step count early in prep, around 7K steps, and when I couldn't hit the step count, I would do some cardio on our rower at home, and I did kind of that powerlifting / bodybuilding approach. And where I ended up was my low days typically being between 1,400 to 1,700 calories with 2 highs at 2,500 calories, not really doing much of the rowing anymore, but keeping my steps between 10 to 12K. And then finally, when I was about 10 days out from Worlds, we thought, you know what, we're as lean as we need to get, and we can start eating up and trying to restore some fullness and start the reverse diet process, eating up into the show to look as good as possible. And that was successful. It did require me to basically need to recover my GI tract. I had some pretty intense constipation for a while, and there was a little bit of blurriness initially, so my body was maybe a little too acclimated to low calories. But the eating up process, we jumped to around 2,100 calories, and I just ate that every single day for the last 10 days leading up into Worlds, except for we topped me off on the Thursday before I competed on Sunday. We went up to 400 grams of carbs, and then we kept it at 250 grams of carbs on the Friday. And then the Saturday, we upped it a little bit because I was on my feet all day. We actually jumped me back up to like 2,200 calories. I think I was around 300 grams of carbs when all was said and done. And that was just to top the fuel tank off. And then on show day, I eat almost nothing. It's pretty minimal. I woke up, had a little bit of carbohydrates and some fats. So I had some scrambled eggs and some potatoes. Good mix of potassium and sodium because I put hot sauce and salt on the eggs and on potatoes. And then before I got on stage, all I had was deli meat, just to give me a little bit of something to eat and also get my sodium up. And then I just kept the water pumping, and that's the product of what you see on stage here. So that was what I did as far as the X's and O's. As low as I got in terms of calories was 1,400, and as high as I got was my high days at 2,500, and then eating up to where I had every single day at 2,100. The biggest load I had for any show was before the Australia show. I had 500 grams of carbohydrates on the Wednesday, and then I tapered in. And I didn't need to load that much for Worlds because, I was on high days already. So, what is the plan now? Well, I'm basically doing a moderate recovery diet because my plan is to compete in 2025 and try to do Worlds again and do a pro show, which means I need to take a lot of advantage of the time I have. Fortunately, I preserved so much physiology and psychology. I'm feeling great already. I'm up to like 80 kilos, which is about 1.5 kilos over my lowest stage weight. I really didn't do much as far as celebrating. I definitely went to Cheesecake Factory, and I've been eating normally. I've been eating in the high 2,000 calories, and I brought my step counts down to 6 to 8K. But I've had no blowouts, no binges. On the day of Worlds where we went out and celebrated, like I said, I eat almost nothing on show day. So even if I go out and eat 2,000 calories, which I did at Cheesecake Factory, I ended the day on 3,000 calories. And the next day we had a family breakfast and we did a photo shoot, which you'll get to see some of that great media. I was probably around 2,600 calories again. And we're just going to keep doing that until I'm up to about 82, 83 kilos, and then I'll slow it down. And I suspect I'll hit that by either late December or early January. And you know what, folks? After that, we're going to start the off season. So look out for my new vlog on my off season. See you then.